The chamber held 412 species, and every single one of them was laughing at me. I did not move. I did not blink. I stood at the center podium of the Grand Conclave Chamber on Theta Station, holding my data slate at my side, and I let them laugh. My name is Cale Marin. I am 61 years old. I have spent 32 of those years serving the United Earth Defense Force, and the last 4 of them as Earth's senior diplomatic representative to the Galactic Council. I know how to stand still while people underestimate me. I have had a great deal of practice. The Vethkai delegate, whose name translated roughly as honored voice of the first shore, was the one who started it. He made a wet, clicking sound deep in his throat, and his translator bead rendered it in clean, perfect English as amusement. Then the Arathi ambassador joined in with a low harmonic hum. Then the Shen Collective's shared body representative flickered its bioluminescent panels in quick, rhythmic pulses that their cultural database defined as open mockery. Within 30 seconds, the entire chamber had found its own version of laughter, and all of it was directed at the single human standing alone at the center of the room. I had just delivered Earth's final warning. The words had been clear. The Vethkai hegemony had spent 11 years using legal loopholes in the Council's resource-sharing accords to strip mine 4 human colony worlds. They had pulled iron, rare earth elements, and deep-core minerals from land that human families farmed, worked, and built homes on. They had done it legally. That was the part that made my jaw ache from clenching. Every extraction permit was filed correctly. Every bribe to the right council clerk had been documented under a different category. The law, as written, gave them the right to access unclaimed planetary substrata on member worlds with fewer than 50 million registered colonists. Our lawyers had fought it for 8 years. We lost every time. So I stood before the council and I delivered the ultimatum that Earth's joint government had authorized. A full independent tribunal. Reparations equal to the assessed value of all extracted material, plus a 100% damages penalty. And a permanent human seat on the security directorate, so that no species could ever again quietly rewrite the rules of the room while we were locked outside the door. And if those 3 conditions were not met within 30 galactic days, Earth would invoke the severance clause. Full withdrawal from the Galactic Council. Every human ship, every human trade agreement, every human contribution to council infrastructure, gone. That was when the Vethkai delegate laughed, and everybody followed. Admiral Marin, the honored voice said, his translator perfectly smooth, almost pleasant. Humanity has been a member of this council for 60 years. In that time, you have contributed a great deal of agricultural product, some useful recycling techniques, and a rather charming tradition of loud music. You are not a military power. You are not an economic cornerstone. You are, if I may speak plainly, a minor species with an inflated opinion of your own leverage. I let the silence that followed land exactly where I wanted it to land. You have 30 days, I said. Just that, nothing more. Then I walked out. The corridor outside the chamber was long and white and lit by soft blue panels that the council's designers had chosen because they were calming to the largest number of member species. I did not find them calming. I found them cold. I walked the full length of the corridor at the same pace I had entered, neither faster nor slower, and I did not look back when the sound of laughter rose again behind the chamber doors. The Lyran ambassador fell into step beside me for about 40 meters. She said nothing. She was one of the species I had privately considered a friend. She had sat completely silent while the chamber laughed. She reached out and touched my arm, just briefly, just once, and then she peeled away into a side corridor and was gone. I kept walking. My shuttle was docked on level 9, Bay 42. It took me 11 minutes to reach it. I sat in the pilot's seat, and I did not engage the engines for a long time. I just looked at the stars through the forward viewport. Theta Station orbited a dead star, a white dwarf, so dense and dim that it gave off almost no light, and so the stars outside my window were spectacular and sharp and absolutely indifferent to everything that had just happened in that chamber. I thought about the 4 colony worlds. I thought about the farmers on New Carthage who had started to notice the subsidence cracks in their fields as the Vethkai drilling rigs pulled material from 2 kilometers below. I thought about the town of Harwick on Ellison's Promise, where the ground had shifted enough in 3 years to crack the foundations of the school. I thought about the fact that those children had gone to class in a cracked building while 400 species laughed at the person trying to stop it. I opened my secure communicator. The channel connected without a ring. It was always open on the other end, had been for months. It's done, I said. The warning is delivered. The voice on the other end belonged to Director Nadia Ose, the head of Project Silence, the most classified program in the history of human civilization. She had a calm voice. She always had a calm voice. I used to find it irritating until I realized it was not a personality trait. It was a trained response, the same way I had trained myself to stand still while people laughed. How did they receive it? she asked. They laughed, I said. There was a pause, not a surprised pause, a satisfied pause. Good, she said. I almost asked her why that was good, but I already knew the answer. The laughter was the confirmation we needed. It told us that the Council, in its 412 species of collective arrogance, had not spent a single moment in 60 years, genuinely considering what humanity might do if pushed far enough. They had watched us argue among ourselves in the early years, stumble through diplomatic embarrassments, struggle with technology that was generations behind the Vethkai standard, and they had concluded that we were exactly what we appeared to be: loud, emotional, harmless. They had never asked the question that mattered. They had never asked what we were building when nobody was watching. The clock started the moment I walked in, I said. We know, Nadia said. Come home, Kale. I engaged the engines, and the shuttle pulled away from Theta Station. I did not look back. There was nothing left to see there. Everything that mattered now was in the silence ahead, in the 30 days that the Council thought were a countdown to nothing, and that we knew were a countdown to everything. I set the course for Earth, and I let myself, for the first time in 4 years, feel something close to calm. 29 days later, every human ship in the galaxy vanished. Not one, not a fleet, all of them. Every registered vessel flying the blue and white banner of the United Earth Defense Force, every civilian freighter carrying grain and medical supplies along the corridor routes, every science probe circling the gas giants of the outer colonies, every private shuttle, every automated cargo drone, 40,217 ships, gone from every sensor grid in the galaxy within a 6-minute window. There was no explosion, no emergency signal, no debris field, no radiation burst that might indicate weapons fire. The ships were there, and then they were not, and the silence they left behind was so absolute that every species with listening equipment pointed at human space spent the next 18 hours convinced their sensors had malfunctioned. I was not on any of those ships. I am telling this story from a small facility built inside a volcanic plateau in Iceland, on Earth, 7 years after these events. I have thought carefully about how to describe what happened next, because the order in which things are revealed matters enormously when you are trying to explain how a species that everyone dismissed managed to change the shape of the galaxy without firing a single weapon. Let me tell you what the Council did first, because it is important. The Vethkai delegate, the honored voice of the First Shore, received the news of the mass disappearance approximately 4 hours after it happened. He was in his private quarters on Theta Station when his aide delivered the report. According to intercepts that our people recovered later, his first response was not concern. It was confusion, and then, very quickly, a cold and careful kind of fear. He summoned the full Council Emergency Committee within the hour. By the time the committee convened, 3 different Vethkai intelligence teams had confirmed the same thing. 40,000 human ships had simply ceased to exist on any spectrum of detection. Gravitic sensors showed nothing. Thermal sweeps returned blank. Tachyon echo tracking, which could follow the shadow of a vessel moving at 3 times light speed, found no trace. Even dark matter resonance imaging, which was the most expensive and the most precise detection technology available to Council members, returned only clean, empty space where human ships had been sailing minutes before. The Council's senior science advisor, a Shen collective cluster named 7-9 Coherent, issued a probability analysis within 6 hours. The probability of simultaneous catastrophic failure across 40,000 unlinked ships, accounting for mechanical variance, navigational differences, and the statistical impossibility of synchronized accidents without communication, was so close to zero that 7-9 Coherent's own internal processing systems flagged the calculation as corrupted and ran it 3 more times before accepting the result. The ships had not failed, the ships had not been destroyed, the ships had vanished on purpose. What 7-9 Coherent could not calculate, because it did not have the data to work with, was how. I will tell you how, because I was one of the few people on Earth who knew the full picture. Director Osei trusted me with it the year before I walked into that council chamber, partly because she needed someone who understood the diplomatic side of what we were doing, and partly, I think, because she wanted at least one person outside the program who could look at the whole thing and tell her honestly if it was going to work. It was called Operation Blindfold, but Operation Blindfold was only the surface of something much larger. The masking technology at the center of it had taken 23 years to develop. It began with a theoretical paper published by a physicist named Owen Grant at the University of Cape Town, who was studying the behavior of gravitational lensing around collapsed stellar objects. Owen was not trying to hide ships. He was trying to understand why certain neutron stars appeared slightly displaced from their actual position when viewed through dense gas clouds. He noticed that the distortion was not random. It followed a pattern that suggested the space around those stars was interacting with background radiation in a way that standard physics did not fully account for. Owen published his paper. The Council's science observers, who monitored human research the way you might monitor a child's homework, categorized it as a minor theoretical curiosity and moved on. Earth's Classified Research Division, which had been quietly watching for exactly this kind of foundational discovery, put 3 teams on it within a month. Over the next decade, those teams, working in separate locations with no knowledge of each other's contributions, feeding their results to a central coordination hub that none of them had clearance to access directly, built the framework for what became the quantum masking field. It did not work by bending light, which is what most species assumed when they later tried to reverse engineer it. It worked by harmonizing a vessel's complete energy output with the background radiation of its surrounding space, not canceling the output, but synchronizing it so precisely that no sensor system designed to detect anomalies could distinguish the ship from the environment it moved through. Visual stealth was the easy part. Infrared masking had been theorized by multiple species and was considered achievable in principle, if not yet practical. The breakthrough that nobody had anticipated was the gravitic component. A ship has mass. Mass bends space. Bending space is something that every gravitic sensor in the galaxy was designed to detect, because it is the fundamental signature of anything large and solid moving through the universe. Owen Grant's mathematics, applied 7 levels deeper than Owen himself ever intended, produced a field geometry that distributed a vessel's gravitational signature across such a wide area that it fell below the threshold of coherence, the same way a single drop of ink disappears in a large enough body of water. The ships were not invisible. They were indistinguishable from background noise across every spectrum simultaneously. Visual, thermal, tachyon, gravitic, dark matter resonance, all of it. Every ship had been fitted with the field generators over the preceding 4 years during scheduled maintenance windows, in orbital dry docks that were themselves masked from Council observation satellites. The 6-minute window was not an accident or a coincidence. Every ship in the fleet had been given a single timing pulse, preloaded before they left port, embedded in the rotation frequency of pulsar LGM-7, a navigational reference point that every human pilot tracked as a matter of standard practice. When the pulse fired, the masking fields activated simultaneously across 40,000 ships in 47 star systems. No radio communication required, no command signal that could be intercepted, just a timing pulse in a pulsar that had been quietly, carefully, and invisibly reprogrammed by a team of human astronomers who had spent 4 years positioning a string of relay stations along its beam. The Galactic Council did not know about the relay stations. The relay stations looked like standard astronomical monitoring equipment, which is exactly what they also were, so that any inspection would find real data being collected by real instruments. The ships were not gone. They were sailing, silent and dark, in exactly the places they had always been, and the galaxy had simply lost the ability to see them. I watched the Council's emergency broadcast on a stolen Lyran frequency from the facility in Iceland. Director Ose sat beside me, drinking tea, watching the honored voice of the First Shore demand that Earth's government provide its location immediately for urgent consultation. His translator rendered his tone as urgent. His body language, which I had spent 4 years learning to read, told a different story. His secondary feeding tendrils, which the Vethkai only extended when their nervous system was in genuine distress, were fully visible above the collar of his formal robe. He was afraid. Not of our weapons, not of our military strength, which he had correctly assessed as inferior to the Vethkai hegemonies on the day he laughed at me. He was afraid because something had happened that did not fit any model he had for human behavior, and the Vethkai, like most of the Council's dominant species, were extraordinarily uncomfortable with things that did not fit their models. They had built their understanding of humanity on 60 years of observable data, and in 6 minutes, every predictive framework they possessed had become useless. I watched the honored voice deliver his demands to an empty frequency, and I thought about the farmers in Harwick, and the cracked school, and the children who had gone to class in a building with broken foundations while the galaxy laughed. I did not smile, but I felt something settle in my chest that had been tight for a very long time. Nadia refilled her tea and said, without looking away from the screen, Phase 2 begins in 72 hours. Outside our window, Iceland's sky was dark and full of stars, and hidden among those stars, invisible and patient and perfectly still, 40,000 human ships waited for the word that would bring them back. There is a question I have been asked more times than I can count, in the years since everything changed. People want to know when it started. They want a date, a moment, a decision. They think there must have been a single room where a single person looked at a map of the galaxy and said, "Here, this is where we begin." That is not how it happened. It never is, with the things that actually matter. The true beginning was a session of the Galactic Council 60 years before I walked into that chamber. Humanity had just been granted junior membership status after a decade of diplomatic negotiation that our historians now describe, with the kind of restraint that comes from embarrassment, as enthusiastic. We arrived with delegations and gift baskets and speeches about mutual prosperity. We were assigned an observer seat on the lower tier, 1 level below full voting membership, 2 levels below the security directorate, and approximately 8 levels below any position where our opinions would actually influence policy. In the very first session we attended as members, the Vethkai put forward a motion to classify human genetic material as a biologically novel resource, subject to Council research access provisions. It passed by 341 votes to 47. Earth's observer seat had no vote. No human in that room was permitted to speak against it. Our lead diplomat at the time, a woman named Grace Holloway, sat in her chair and wrote in her private journal, which was declassified 30 years later, "They think we are a curiosity. I think they may have made the most expensive mistake in Council history." Grace Holloway came home and filed a report that recommended, in its conclusion section, that humanity begin immediately and quietly constructing capabilities that would never be visible to Council observers. Not offensive capabilities. Not weapons, at least not primarily. She recommended something subtler and more permanent, the capacity to become invisible when we chose to, and the capacity to sustain ourselves completely independently of the Council's economic systems, and the capacity to document, in meticulous and legally airtight detail, every violation the Council and its member species ever committed against human interests. Her report was classified at the highest level. It went to a joint session of every national government on Earth that still had functioning intelligence services, which at that time was most of them. They argued about it for 18 months. Then they voted. The vote was not unanimous. Nothing involving every government on Earth ever is. But it passed, and a program was authorized, and it was given a name that I have always found slightly too neat for something so enormous: Project Silence. I want to be clear about what Project Silence was not. It was not a weapons program, though weapons were eventually part of it. It was not a conspiracy against the Council, though it operated in complete secrecy. It was, at its heart, a decision made by a species that had been laughed at and dismissed, and quietly exploited, to take 60 years and build, in the dark, everything they would need to never be helpless again. Director Nadia Osei was the 4th person to hold the title of Director of Project Silence. She took the post 14 years before my visit to Theta Station, inheriting a program that had already produced remarkable results, and also accumulated remarkable complexity. She was the one who introduced me to it, in a briefing room beneath the Atacama Desert that I reached by elevator from what appeared, on the surface, to be a geological survey station. The facility was extraordinary, not in an obvious way. It was not gleaming or dramatic or designed to impress visitors, because impressing visitors was precisely what it was not built to do. It was deep, and it was dense, and it was full of people doing specific pieces of work with no complete picture of the whole. The mathematician in one wing was developing theoretical frameworks for distributed gravitational imaging. The materials engineer in another wing was testing alloys for low thermal signature hull plating. The legal analyst in a third wing was cataloging Council treaty violations going back 50 years. None of them knew what the others were doing. None of them needed to. Nadia showed me the 3 pillars of the project, and I am going to describe them carefully, because the world deserves to understand what 60 years of quiet human determination actually looked like in practice. The first pillar was the masking grid. I have already described the physics of it, the quantum field technology derived from Owen Grant's astronomical research, developed across a dozen isolated teams and assembled at the coordination hub that only a handful of people at the highest classification level ever saw in full. What I have not described is the manufacturing scale of it. The field generators were small. Each one fit inside a standard equipment housing the size of a carry-on bag, but they were extraordinarily precise instruments, and they had to be fitted to every vessel in the human fleet, 40,000 ships. Every one serviced during routine maintenance, with the generators installed by technicians who were told they were installing updated navigational calibration equipment, which was technically true, in the way that calling a masterwork painting colored liquid on fabric is technically true. The generators were manufactured in 6 facilities located in different countries, each producing a specific component, none producing a complete unit. The final assembly happened in a single location in the Atacama facility, in a room that was not on any architectural plan of the building. The assembled units were shipped out as replacement sensor components in standard logistics crates that passed through Council customs inspection dozens of times without detection, because they were, individually, exactly what their labels claimed. The second pillar was the ghost fleet. This is the part of the story that surprises people the most, and I understand why. 300 warships, built over 40 years, in construction sites that no council observer ever detected. The sites were not hidden in deep space, or behind gas clouds, or in asteroid belts, though some components were fabricated in those locations. The main construction happened in the shadow of Earth's own moon, in a series of yards built into the lunar far-side terrain, accessible only through underground shafts that looked from orbit like standard mining operations, because they were also standard mining operations, running simultaneously. The ships are remarkable. They are not, individually, the equal of the Vethkai hegemony's most advanced dreadnoughts. The Vethkai have been building warships for 900 years, and they are very good at it. But the Ghost Fleet was not designed to win a conventional engagement against a superior force. It was designed to appear from nowhere, to operate without detection, to be in the place where it was not expected, and to make a statement without firing a weapon if at all possible. I will come back to the Ghost Fleet. The third pillar was what the project internally called the Ledger. It was, in some ways, the most human thing about the entire program. For 60 years, a team of legal analysts, historians, forensic economists, and diplomatic archivists had been collecting, verifying, and cataloging every single instance of council or member species action against human interests that violated council law. Not alleged violations, documented violations with primary sources, with cross-reference treaty language, with financial impact assessments. The ledger contained 4,622 individual violations. Each one had been reviewed by at least 3 independent legal teams operating in isolation from each other, so that confirmation bias could not creep into the analysis. Each one had been rated by severity, by the financial damage it caused, and by the degree of deliberateness, the distinction between a violation that resulted from ambiguity in treaty language and a violation that was clearly intentional. Of the 4,622 violations, 2,908 were rated as clearly deliberate. The Vethkai hegemony alone accounted for 841 violations, of which 673 were rated deliberate. The strip mining of the 4 colony worlds was not an isolated incident. It was the visible tip of something that had been happening in smaller and less obvious ways for 6 decades. There were also the colony worlds themselves. When humanity began planting colonies on other planets 60 years ago, the Council's response was to require that all colonies be registered under a shared territorial framework that gave human settlers specific rights and specific obligations. The rights were real. The obligations were onerous. And buried in the fine print of the Colonial Registration Accords was a provision that had seemed minor at the time and had grown, year by year, into one of the most consequential pieces of law in human history. Registered colonies were required to maintain minimum viable external communication capability, which in practice meant that their communication systems had to be compatible with Council monitoring standards. Council monitoring standards included a passive observation requirement. The Council had the legal right to maintain passive sensor observation of all registered colony worlds, which it used primarily to verify that colonial populations were complying with environmental regulations. It was not an invasive right, but it was a real one, and it meant that every human colony world was visible to Council sensors as a matter of law. What the Council did not know, what no non-human species had any idea about, was that maintaining minimum viable external communication capability was not the same as maintaining only minimum viable external communication capability. The colonial governments had, over the course of 40 years, quietly and completely rebuilt their infrastructure from the ground up. What appeared on Council sensors as a modest communications array connected to a standard colonial settlement was, in reality, the visible surface of something much larger. Every human colony world had been converted, piece by piece, structure by structure, into a fortified position, not a military base, nothing so obvious. But underneath the farms and the towns and the schools, under 2 and 3 and in some cases 5 kilometers of bedrock, there was another world. Shield generators capable of projecting a field that could resist a sustained Vethkai orbital bombardment for approximately 72 hours. Automated defense networks that could engage landing parties without requiring a human operator. Underground cities that could house the entire surface population for 6 months without external resupply. Food stores, medical facilities, power generation systems that drew from geothermal sources deep enough to be undetectable from orbit. The surface of every human colony world was real. The farms were real farms. The schools were real schools. The people living there were real people living real lives. But if the surface was ever threatened, it would empty in under 4 hours, and what the aggressor would find afterward would be a landscape with no people in it, and a ground that would not allow itself to be approached. The Vethkai had been drilling next to these bunkers. For 11 years, their extraction equipment had been pulling material from strata 2 kilometers below the surface of New Carthage and Ellison's Promise, and the other 2 colony worlds, and they had never once detected the shield emitters buried at 3 kilometers, or the tunnel networks at 4, or the automated rail systems at 5. I want to be fair about something. Not every person involved in Project Silence was calm and certain. Not every decision was made without doubt. Nadia told me once, very quietly, in the facility beneath the Atacama, that there had been 3 separate moments in the program's history when the leadership had considered shutting it all down. Not because the work was going badly, but because the weight of the secrecy was becoming unbearable. Thousands of people working on pieces of something enormous, unable to tell their families what they were doing, unable to share the satisfaction of their work with the world. Engineers who spent careers building components they would never see assembled. Pilots who entered the ghost fleet by officially ceasing to exist. Legal death certificates. Grieving families who were quietly told the truth years later and asked to keep the secret. Spouses who waited and did not know why. The cost of Project Silence was not money. Money was there, quietly redistributed through budget allocations that the Council's economic observers never fully audited because human finances were considered too chaotic to be worth close attention. The cost was human. It was carried by individuals who chose to do something invisible and difficult because they believed it mattered, and who never got to see it matter in their lifetimes. Owen Grant, the physicist who published the paper that started everything, died 14 years before the masking fields activated. He never knew what his mathematics had become. I think about him sometimes. I hope wherever he is, something in the universe let him know. On the night that the masking fields went active, on the night that 40,000 ships went dark and the galaxy discovered that humanity had learned a new kind of quiet, I stood in the facility in Iceland with Nadia and watched the Council's emergency channels collapse into noise and confusion. And I felt 2 things at exactly the same time, which is not unusual but is usually much less intense. I felt something enormous and bright and almost overwhelming, which I can only describe as pride, though that word is too small for it. Pride for Owen Grant and the teams he never knew about. Pride for the pilots sitting in dark cockpits across 47 star systems, trusting a plan they had rehearsed for years. Pride for the colonists in the underground cities of New Carthage, calm and prepared and waiting. And I felt tired. The specific tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep but from carrying something heavy for a very long time, and finally being allowed to set it down. They still don't know about the ledger, Nadia said. No, I said. They will in 72 hours. Yes. She finished her tea. Outside, the Iceland sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. Somewhere above us, a masking field hummed at a frequency no sensor in the galaxy could detect, and 40,000 ships sailed on in perfect silence. And the galaxy slowly began to understand that it had made a very serious mistake. On the 47th day after the vanishing, 3 Vethkai destroyers attempted to land ground forces on New Carthage. They chose New Carthage because it was the colony world closest to the Vethkai hegemony's territorial boundary, and because it was the world where the most extensive strip mining had occurred, and because the honored voice had apparently decided that if Earth was going to withdraw from the Council and go silent, the Vethkai might as well take the resources they had already been legally extracting, and formalize the arrangement. The destroyers entered orbital space without a declaration of intent. They did not transmit a landing request to the colonial government, because as far as their sensors told them, there was no longer a colonial government to request permission from. The colony had gone dark with everything else. Their sensors showed empty surface structures, no power signatures, no communication activity. They sent down 4 landing shuttles with armed security forces. The Vethkai word for them translates as compliance officers, which has always struck me as a remarkably honest piece of language for something the galaxy would call soldiers. The shuttles landed in the main agricultural zone of New Carthage, which had been left exactly as it was. Fields, fencing, equipment sitting idle in the middle of jobs that had been abandoned when the population moved underground. The compliance officers spread out across the landing zone. They reported empty buildings, stored equipment, no resistance. The lead officer transmitted back to the destroyers that the colony appeared abandoned and that the extraction equipment could resume operations immediately. 40 minutes after landing, the ground opened. Not dramatically, no explosion, no rising platform. 47 separate panels in the soil, each one 2 meters square, lifted smoothly and simultaneously, and from each one rose an automated defense turret. The turrets were rail systems, magnetically accelerated projectile launchers, fully automated, programmed with a single priority: disable, not destroy. The compliance officers were not harmed. Their equipment was. Every weapon they carried was rendered non-functional within 90 seconds by targeted, precise fire that hit the barrel or the power cell of each weapon individually, without touching the person holding it. The turrets then retracted, the panels closed, the field went still. The lead compliance officer stood in an empty field, holding a weapon that would not fire, and transmitted a single message to the destroyers: request immediate extraction. The destroyers departed New Carthage without recovering their extraction equipment, which the automated systems had also methodically disassembled and left in a neat pile at the edge of the landing zone. I received the report in Iceland, and I allowed myself one very small, very private moment of satisfaction. Then I called Nadia and told her it was time. The ship I traveled on was registered as the Earth diplomatic courier vessel Ardent. It was not one of the Ghost Fleet. It was a real, registered, visible ship, because what I was about to do required being seen. We decloaked from the masking field 100,000 kilometers outside Theta Station, in the middle of a Council naval patrol zone, transmitting our identification codes loudly and clearly on every standard frequency. We requested landing clearance. The Council's response time was unusually fast. The Grand Conclave chamber was arranged differently when I entered this time. The laughter was gone. The 412 species were still present, in their seats, in their tiers, but the atmosphere was so different from my previous visit that it felt like a different room. There was no pre-session chatter. There were no theatrical sighing sounds from the Urathi section. The Shen Collective's shared body representative was still, its bioluminescent panels dark. I walked to the center podium. I placed my data slate on the lectern. I looked up at the honored voice of the first shore, who was sitting in his tier with his secondary feeding tendrils fully extended, which I now recognized as his nervous system's response to sustained distress. Admiral Marin, said the Council's presiding officer, an elderly Lyran female named Councillor Veith, who had held the position for 130 years, and whose neutrality was genuinely respected by most members. Earth has been listed as an absent member for 47 days. This council is relieved that your government has chosen to re-engage. My government has chosen to present its terms, I said. I activated the data slate and the chamber's display system, which council staff had, after significant internal debate, agreed to let me connect to, because refusing a diplomatic presentation was a procedural violation that even the most nervous council member did not want on their record, filled with the first page of what we had spent 60 years building. I said, "This is the ledger." I did not read it out loud. It was 4,622 violations long, and I am not a person who believes in theatrical excess when the document itself does the work. I let the chamber's automated translation and display systems render it across every member species' preferred format simultaneously, and I stood quietly while the room read. It took a long time. Councillor Veith called a recess after the first 40 minutes because 3 member species representatives were showing signs of physiological distress. During the recess, I sat in the diplomatic waiting room and drank water and did not speak to the 17 different aides and junior diplomats who came to find me with various versions of, "Surely we can discuss this informally." When the session resumed, the honored voice attempted to challenge the legal standing of the ledger's documentation. His team had clearly been working through the recess. He raised 7 procedural objections in sequence, each one carefully constructed, each one referencing specific provisions of Council evidentiary standards. Each one was answered immediately by Earth's legal team, who had been sitting quietly in the secondary gallery, and who had prepared for every objection they might face, because they had been preparing for this specific conversation for 11 years. The honored voice's 7th objection was his last. He fell silent after it was answered, and the silence in the chamber was the loudest thing I had heard in 4 years of diplomatic work. I presented the same 3 conditions I had presented 47 days earlier: a full independent tribunal, reparations equal to the assessed value of all extracted material plus a 100% damages penalty, and a permanent human seat on the Security Directorate. Then I said, I would also like to note that the ledger covers violations by 23 additional council member species. Earth is prepared to discuss those matters through the tribunal process as well, on a species-by-species basis, with full cooperation and without prejudice. 19 of those 23 species voted for our conditions within the hour. The other 4 abstained. The Vethkai voted against, which was their right as a full member. They were the only species to do so. The motion passed. In the corridor afterward, the honored voice found me alone near the exit to the docking bays. His translator bead was deactivated. He spoke in his own language, and my personal translator, a more advanced unit than the Council's standard-issue hardware, rendered it quietly into my earpiece. "You said there was a Phase 2, he said, that we had not found all your ships." "Yes," I said. "Was that true?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How many?" I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "Enough." I left him standing in the corridor and walked to my ship. In my earpiece, Nadia's voice said, "We saw the vote. Well done." Thank you, I said. The tribunal is going to take 3 years. I know. You should sleep on the way back. You look terrible in the camera feeds. I'll sleep when I'm retired, I said. There was a pause. Then Nadia said quietly, Kale, it worked. I sat in the pilot's seat of the Ardent. Outside my viewport, Theta Station turned slowly against the white dwarf's faint glow, and the stars beyond it were sharp and steady, and absolutely indifferent to what had just happened in the chamber behind me. Yes, I said, it did. I set the course for home. 5 years after the vote, I built a house on New Carthage. I had not planned to retire there. I had not planned to retire anywhere in particular. I had, for most of my adult life, been too occupied with the immediate task in front of me to spend much time planning what I would do when there were no more immediate tasks. But Nadia suggested it, in the particular tone she uses when she is not actually suggesting something but is instead informing you of what you are going to do, and I found that I did not object. New Carthage was different by then. The council tribunal had been completed 18 months earlier, and the reparations settlement had funded a reconstruction effort on all 4 affected colony worlds that was, to put it plainly, transformative. The subsidence cracks in the agricultural zones were filled and reinforced. The school in Harwick had been rebuilt, not repaired, rebuilt, on stable ground, with a foundation that could have supported a building 10 times its size. The town had thrown a small ceremony for the completion, and they had invited me, and I had sat in the back of the gathering and watched the children running around the new building, and felt something I still do not have a precise name for. The underground infrastructure on New Carthage remained. The shield generators, the tunnel networks, the automated systems. They are maintained now by a small crew of technicians, and their existence has been disclosed to the Council under the terms of the new Accord, as defensive infrastructure, which the Accord permits. The Vethkai's legal team attempted to argue during the Accord negotiations that the undisclosed construction of defensive fortifications beneath registered colony worlds violated the Colonial Registration Accords. Earth's legal team pointed out, with tremendous patience and a very thick supporting document, that the Accords specified requirements for external communication compatibility and environmental compliance, and said nothing whatsoever about what a colony was permitted to build underground. The Vethkai team did not press the point further. The Ghost Fleet sails openly now. 300 ships, registered, flagged, their specifications fully disclosed under the arms transparency provisions of the new Accord. They are not the largest warships in the galaxy. They are not the most heavily armed, but every species on the Council knows where they came from. And every species on the Council knows that if those ships existed in secret for 40 years, there may be things that also exist that are not yet visible. Nobody says this out loud. Nobody needs to. Human presence on the Security Directorate has changed the Council's legislative process in ways that I find quietly satisfying to observe. Not through confrontation. We have 3 seats, not a majority, and we have no interest in replacing one form of dominance with another. But when a piece of legislation appears before the full council that would benefit large species at the expense of smaller ones, there is now a consistent, documented, legally sophisticated voice that says, we have seen this before, we have recorded this before, and we are recording it now. The effect is not dramatic, it is gradual. But the legislation passes in better forms than it would have otherwise. The Lyran ambassador, Councillor Veith's junior colleague, a young female named Petra who had taken her post only 6 months before I walked into the chamber that first day, came to see me in Iceland before I moved to New Carthage. She sat across from me in the facility's small meeting room and she said, without preamble, I want to apologize. I said, for what specifically? She said, for staying silent. When the chamber laughed. My senior colleague stayed silent and I followed her example, and I have thought about it almost every day since. I considered this carefully. Then I said, your senior colleague squeezed my arm in the corridor afterward. That meant something to me. Petra looked at the table. Then she looked at me. The Lyran government would like to request a bilateral consultation with Earth's Security Directorate representation. We would like to discuss what our silence cost, and what we would like to do differently. That, I said, is the right conversation. We had it. It took 4 sessions and produced a small but real treaty that established a formal consultation protocol between Earth and Lyra on Security Directorate matters. It was not a dramatic document. It did not make headlines in the Council's news services. It was the kind of thing that matters slowly and permanently, which is the best kind of thing. I have had many conversations about the Memorial of the Unnamed in the 5 years since it was built. It stands near the United Nations headquarters in Geneva, in a small plaza that was redesigned specifically to accommodate it. The memorial is not large. It is a single column of dark stone, approximately 4 meters tall, smooth on all sides, with a single line of text carved at eye level. The text is in every language currently spoken on Earth. running around the full circumference of the column in a band of script so fine that you have to stand close to read it. The text reads the same in all of them. They knew, they waited, they held. There are no names on the memorial. This was deliberate. The names of many Project Silence participants have since been released, and a public archive exists where anyone can research individual contributions to the program. But the memorial itself carries no names, because the point it is making is not about individuals, it is about the decision. The collective, sustained, generation-crossing decision that a species made when it was laughed at and dismissed, and quietly taken advantage of, to spend 60 years building something that nobody could see, so that the laughter would eventually stop. Owen Grant's name is in the archive. His section includes a reproduction of his original paper and a carefully written account of how his work was identified, classified, and developed into the masking technology. His family was invited to the dedication of the memorial. His granddaughter stood in front of the column for a long time. I stood nearby, not close enough to intrude, and I watched her read the line of text in the stone, and I saw her expression do something complicated that I understood completely. I have a granddaughter of my own. Her name is Clara, and she is 7 years old, and she lives with my daughter on New Carthage, which is why I built my house there. Clara does not fully understand what happened. 7 years old is young for galactic politics, but she knows that her grandfather was involved in something important, and she knows that the school she attends was rebuilt, and she knows that the fields around Harwick no longer have cracks in them. This is enough for now. I will explain the rest when she is older, in whatever amount of detail seems useful to a child who is growing up in a galaxy that is not perfect but is genuinely, measurably better than it was. On a clear night from my house, I can see the lights of Harwick in the distance. The town is bigger now. People have moved there because the reconstruction brought work, and the work brought people, and the people brought the things that people bring: noise, arguments, music, festivals, the specific cheerful chaos of a human community that has decided it intends to stay. I sit outside some evenings and look at those lights and then look up at the stars beyond them, and I think about the question that Petra asked me 6 months after the vote during one of our bilateral consultation sessions. She had been reading the archive material on Project Silence and she looked at me and said, "What was the hardest part?" I told her the truth. I said the hardest part was standing in that chamber and listening to the laughter and knowing what we had already built and knowing that nothing I could say in that room would make them understand, not because they lacked the intelligence to understand it, but because they had decided, long before I walked through those doors, that we were not worth taking seriously, and choosing in that moment not to prove them wrong immediately, choosing to walk out, choosing to let them have their laughter for a few more weeks. She said, "And you were certain the plan would work?" I said, "I was certain we had done the work. Whether the work would be enough, no, I was not certain about that." She thought about this. Then she said, "I think that is braver, actually. Being certain you have worked hard enough to try is different from being certain you will succeed." I have thought about that exchange often since then. It seems to me that Petra understood something important, which is that the courage in Project Silence was not primarily in the technology or the ships or the ledger, though all of those things required courage to build. The courage was in the decision, made 60 years before the masking fields activated, to believe that the work would eventually be enough. To keep building it in the dark, through decades, across generations, through moments of doubt and exhaustion, and the specific grinding difficulty of doing something enormous in complete secrecy, because the alternative was to accept the laughter as a true verdict on what humanity was capable of. The laughter was not a true verdict. It never is. There are other species in the galaxy now, smaller ones, junior members, species newly arrived to council membership who sit in their observer tiers and watch the proceedings and do not yet have a vote, who have reached out to Earth's diplomatic staff with quiet, careful questions about the new Accord's protections, about legal documentation processes, about how the bilateral consultation model works. Nadia handles most of those conversations. She is not retired, and I do not expect she ever will be. She has a particular gift for making people feel that their situation is being taken seriously, and in a galaxy that still has a great deal of not taking seriously to unlearn, that gift is valuable beyond easy description. I do read the reports she sends me. I am still technically a senior consultant to the Security Directorate representation team, which means I attend 4 meetings a year in person and read summaries of everything else. It is the right amount of involvement for someone who has a house on New Carthage and a granddaughter who demands that he teach her to play chess, and who, I should note, is already significantly better at it than I was at her age. Clara asked me, last autumn, why people had laughed at Earth. We were sitting outside after dinner, and the sky was the particular deep blue that New Carthage gets in the evening before the stars appear, and she looked up at it the way children look at things they are genuinely curious about, with her whole face, not just her eyes. I thought about how to answer. Then I said, because they had decided what we were before they bothered to look. She thought about this with the serious expression she gets when she is actually processing something, rather than just waiting for the conversation to continue. Then she said, that was silly of them. Yes, I said. It was. Did it make you angry? I thought about standing in that corridor outside the chamber, listening to the laughter fade behind the closed doors. I thought about the white dwarf star and the cold blue lights and the 30 days that the galaxy thought was a countdown to nothing. It made me focused, I said. She seemed satisfied with this. She went back to looking at the sky, and I went back to looking at it with her, and the first stars appeared one by one in the growing dark, and somewhere among them, moving without sound or signature, the ships that nobody had ever expected us to build were crossing distances that would have seemed impossible 60 years ago, and the galaxy that had laughed at our final warning had learned, slowly and permanently, that the warning had not been a bluff. It had been an invitation to take us seriously before it cost them more than it cost us. They declined the invitation. They paid the price. Clara found a bright point of light near the horizon and asked me which star it was. I told her it was New Carthage's nearest neighbor system, where a small human research station had been established the previous year. She said, "Are there people there?" I said yes. She said, "Do they know we're here?" I said, "Yes, Clara. They know we're here." She smiled at the light for a moment longer. Then she went inside for bed, and I stayed in my chair, and the stars came out in full, and the night was quiet in the way that only a world that has chosen its own security can be quiet. And I sat in it until the lights of Harwick in the distance were the brightest things I could see, and the galaxy above me was simply the galaxy, no longer laughing, waiting to see what we would do next. We are always watching, we are always building, and we are very, very patient.